We're got our secret marker hidden back in the sound booth, I think. Bart, do you see that one on the electrical outlet to your right? That's where it was last time anyway. No. Let's see who it was. Yeah, right there on the electrical outlet. Yes, sir.
Glad that wasn't a snake.
We have to hide our markers or they dry out. Something about these 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds. Good. It's wonderful to have their little voices, but they're not very good for expo markers. Last week we began a study. We're going to follow up with that this week. And it is the recreational use of drugs. We spent pretty much our entire time last week defining this. So we're not going to go too much in depth into that today, but we understand recreational means that is directed by the intention of the use of the drug. Talked about the fact that a drug, we're going to take the Oxford English definition of drug being a medicine or other substance that affects the mind and body. And that's my paraphrase of that. The bottom line is what we're getting at here is this can be it can be a prescription drug, it can be something over the counter, it can be something you grow in your yard. Okay, so it is anything you're ingesting, taking into your body. And for the case of what we're talking about here with recreational, would indicate that it is affecting your mind. Now, we're not talking about the medical use. We're going to get to that later. But we are talking about recreational use. I want to open up class today and say for the first part of our class, we will hold comments. And then in the second part of our class, we'll open up comments. We're going to hold comments because we want to get through some scriptures on this. And then we'll open up comments to discuss some of those scriptures. When we think about the recreational use of drugs, that word recreational becomes important because the idea here is that there is no necessity. It's going to be very important. It's going to be very important as we consider the scriptures we're going to look at. In other words, if I'm taking a drug recreationally, there's no necessity for me to take this drug. When we get to our medical portion, we're going to talk a little bit about something that, just being honest, for the sake of this morning's class, we're taking for granted. And that is that it is okay and it is appropriate to take mind-altering drugs for medicinal purposes, right? So, for instance, I can remember when I was, about 18, and I was going to have my wisdom teeth taken out. And the doctor said to my parents, they gave them a prescription. It was a weird prescription because I think it was like 2 Valiums. So we had to go to the pharmacy and get like 2 Valiums. And they were like, maybe it was 1, I don't remember. And they were like, take this in the morning. Have him take this in the morning before he comes in. And so I took that and I thought, well, that didn't do anything. And I got there and I sat down. But I remember standing up, and I was very nervous about the appointment because I knew what they were going to be doing to me. But I remember standing up and going, I don't care at all that these people are about to operate on me. It doesn't bother me in the least. And that was the intention of the Valium, was that they wanted me to be controlled and not having, some sort of conniption fit. I can also remember as a kid going to the orthodontist, and they would take what they called Mr. Nose and put it on my face, and it was nitrous oxide, right? And they had these little cartoons of Mickey Mouse, and they said, just look at the cartoons. And what were they doing? They were altering my mind in order to work on me without disruption. And we note that a lot. There's drugs that we take that alter our mind for attention deficit hyperactive disorder, for schizophrenia, for anxiety, for depression, and so on and so on and so on. So for the sake of this morning, we'll talk about that when we get to the medicinal use. What I want us to understand is, for the sake of this morning, we're going to assume that that's appropriate without going into all the detail of why biblically that's appropriate. And why the reason that I bring that up is, assuming that it is appropriate to take drugs for medical use, what do you have when there's a medical cause? You have necessity, right? If you're taking drugs recreationally, I'm choosing without necessity to alter the state of my mind with those drugs or those substances. And so as we look at this morning, we want to consider from the scriptures. Remember, each one of these subjects we cover in this class on Christian morals, our question is always this: is this something that a Christian can engage in? And so our question is, can a Christian engage in the recreational use of drugs? Now remember, as we enter into these scriptures, remember, we're not talking about alcohol because that's going to be its own class, right? Not to say alcohol, some of these things won't apply to alcohol, but we're going to cover alcohol all by itself. We're not going to talk about nicotine and caffeine. That's going to be its own class. And so we'll cover that all by itself. And we're not going to talk about the medical use of certain drugs, medical marijuana, medical mushrooms, drugs that are really not prescription, but people are using them for medical reasons. We're not going to talk about those. That'll be its own class. So as we go into this, we're talking about any substance that alters my mind that I'm using recreationally. So let's begin by going to Romans 12:3. Now, you can turn to Romans 12:3. Anybody who can, thankful for Saved by the Bell, the old TV show, because I could never remember the difference between principle and principle. But there was an episode of that where he said the last three letters of principle is pal. So I can always remember. So principle, there's principal, which is the guy that is part of the school, but principle, Bible principles. If you're turning to Romans 12:3 and you happen to know the verse in the Bible that says, thou shalt not recreationally use drugs directly, it states that directly. Thou shalt not use cocaine for fun. Thou shalt not. If you know that verse, turn to it so we can read it out loud together. Does anybody know that verse? Raise your hand if you've got that verse that says it directly. Okay, so no takers on that. Now, let me ask you this, though. Does the Bible have to directly condemn a thing for it to be sinful? Does it have to say in explicit words? In other words, does the Bible have to say that to abduct small children, and as it's happening all over this country, to abduct small children and sell them into slavery is sinful? Does the Bible have to say that abducting little children is sinful for it to be sinful? Does it have to have a verse on child trafficking for child trafficking to be sinful? No. The Bible does not have to address every single sin by a thou shalt not and name that exact sin. There's no verse in the Bible that says thou shalt not sell cocaine at worship services. But we understand that it would be sinful to sell cocaine at worship services. You see what I'm getting at here? So when that is the case, we look at Bible principles and we say, look, if we violate a Bible principle, if our behavior, if our action is to violate a Bible principle, then we can understand that that behavior, that action is sinful. And so we're going to look at some verses on this. We're going to start in Romans 12:3. And he said, for I say this through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. Now I want you to think with me for just a moment. He says here that he wants us to think soberly. What does that word soberly mean? Yeah, that's great. We actually had two statements here that are both correct, and in fact, I mean, you just gave the perfect definition, both of those to put together. Clear mind, sound judgment. If you look up the word here that he's using in the Greek, it's sophrone, and the definition of it is to be of sound mind, sane, figuratively, moderate. To be of sound mind, sound judgment, clear mind, can be used figuratively to mean to be moderate in a person's behavior. Now, when he says to be sober in this passage, is he specifically talking about not ingesting substances that would make you high or drunk? Is that what his meaning is in this passage? And if I'm looking in Romans, where are we, 12:3? Is that his meaning? Is he meaning to address specifically the use of drugs to alter your mind? Is that what he is specifically addressing? No. When we use the word sober, typically what we mean is not drunk, not high on drugs, right? When the Bible uses the word sober, it's not saying not drunk and not high on drugs. But that doesn't change the fact that it still applies to being drunk or high on drugs. Why? Do what? It implies it, yes. Because think of it this way. When we use the word sober, our use of it compared to the Bible use of it is actually cheapened, right? We take the word and we bring it down to about here. The Bible uses the word about here. It has the same line of thinking the way we use it and the way the Bible uses it, but the Bible elevates the concept. For us, sober means what? That you're not stumbling around, fumbling over your words because you're drunk or high. Sober means you're not crashing your car into another car or a telephone pole because you're drunk or you're high. Sober means that you're just at the base normal level of brain activity, right? That's what sober means for us. If you get pulled over by a police officer and he wants to know whether or not you're sober, he doesn't want to know whether or not you're respecting God's word and living godly. He wants to know, are you going to blow a .08 on his breathalyzer, or are you going to have drug materials in your car or in your bloodstream? That's what he wants to know, right? That's our very low definition of sober. But think about this. The low definition we have of sober, you would have to meet that to even have a chance to get to the biblical definition of sober. Because what we're saying is sober means you have the ability to think correctly. And what the Bible definition of sober is, you are thinking correctly, specifically in accordance with God's word and God's principles. Now, if I put myself at a level to where through, and we're going to stick with drugs, I keep alcohol, and I apologize, that's we're not going to do alcohol. But if I choose, without necessity, in other words, I'm just choosing to do it because I want to do it, to ingest a substance that removes my ability to be the base level of sober that even a police officer out here who would pull you over in your car would agree to, and that you'd go to jail for if he pulled you over for it while you were driving doing it. And think about that analogy too, as we're considering this principle. I want you to think about the analogy of driving a car. And then put that next to handling my soul. What's more difficult? To drive your car home from worship today, or to guide your soul to heaven? Yet if you just violated man's definition of sober, just the ability to think right, not even meaning you are thinking right. Have you ever seen somebody driving who didn't appear to be drunk, but they certainly weren't thinking right? You ever seen that happen? I was guilty of that this past week. I completely misunderstood a scenario, and in another circumstance might have caused an accident because I didn't understand where I was on the road. I didn't understand the way that the road was designed in that particular place. I drove through Atlanta, and I ran across about 150,000 of these people that weren't necessarily drunk, but they just have a whole different idea of what it means to drive on a road than I do. I'm not cut out for Atlanta. That's the ocean. I live in a pond. But you think about that. Driving a car. Look, all the cop cares about, he doesn't care if you're intelligent or dumb and you're driving. If you're just basically following the rules of the road and you're not intoxicated, he's okay with you. You don't even have to be thinking right. You don't even have to. I learned a new law I never knew about left-hand turns at a two-way stop the other day. I never understood left-hand turns at a two-way stop. I figured it out the other day. I looked it up because I live at a two-way stop. My neighborhood exited a two-way stop, and every time I stop there, someone either waves me on or they go without waving me on, or it's all this confusion. So I just looked it up. Now, that's just driving a car. If you pull out of this parking lot in a little bit here after worship, if you pull out of this parking lot and you've got a substance, a drug, a substance in you that would cause your mental ability to be depreciated from the normal average, that police officer can take you to jail. But think of the greater concept. I'm trying to get to heaven, and I'm going to take substances that cause me to not even be at the level to drive a vehicle? Which one's more difficult? Which one involves more of my life? Which one involves more of my mind? And not only that, but the standard for this is higher, because when we look at this word sober, when he says here to think soberly, we understand that in the biblical definition, he's talking about right thinking according to biblical principle, according to the Word of God and the traditions given us by the apostles through the inspired Word, our New Testament, and the biblical principles of the Old Testament, Romans 15:4. And so when I consider that, I get pulled over, and that officer says, excuse me. He says, sir, have you been drinking today? And I say, no, officer, I haven't been drinking. He says, ma'am, notice you're swerving a little bit. Have you taken any substances that would impair your judgment? And you said, look, officer, it was a long day. So yeah, I had a few extra painkillers and I popped them before I drove home. What's that police officer going to say to you? He's going to say, step out of that vehicle, isn't he? Keep your hands where I can see them and step out of the vehicle. But you say, but officer, you don't understand. You don't understand. I just need a little recreation. I just need a good time. And he said, but you took a good time and you tried to handle a vehicle. It's not going to go over very well, is it? Let's look at 1 Thessalonians 5. We got a little section here talking about being sober. what we want to do is, we're going to 1 Thessalonians 5, 6 through 8. I want to look at several of these scriptures. Look, nothing's going to change as we go through these scriptures. Nothing's going to change. But what we want to do is we want to drive this point home and look at the fact that the Bible talks about this many times. This word sober is used over and over again. In fact, the word in Romans 12 is used 6 times in the Bible. We have different terms here meaning sober, and yet we're going to look at each one. And the fact of the matter is, even though they're different terms, they all come about to the same meaning, which is what? Thinking rightly, thinking correctly. In 1 Thessalonians 5, 6 through 8, we begin there. He says, "Therefore, let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night. But let us who are of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love and a helmet and hope of salvation." Now, let me ask you a question. When he says sober here, does the meaning of the word sober that he's using here, as you view it in this passage, as you read it in this passage, is it good enough for God if what I say by being sober here is I'm merely not intoxicated? Is that the level to which he's telling us to be sober? No. He says, watch and be sober. In other words, he's talking about a spiritual stance that we take, that we watch and are sober, right-minded, right thinking in our watchfulness. But isn't it interesting in this passage that he contradicts it to something? What does he contradict it to? We said from Romans 12 that being intoxicated would make it impossible to carry out the sobriety, right? Well, what is in verse 7, what does contradict from this idea of being watchful and sober? Sleeping. I got pulled over once in college for sleepy driving. Did you not? And the officer said, "Look, man, if you're tired, pull over and take a nap." And I took his advice. From then on, if I get tired, I pull over and sleep. But he told me today, he said, he didn't give me a ticket, but he's like, it's kind of like explaining, hey, you need to get your mind figured out on this because you're young. But he said, you're more dangerous than a drunk driver. Because at least a drunk driver, he may react slowly, but he'll react. He said, but you'll just hit the pole and never know it happened, never know it came, or you'll hit the other car and never knew it even came. And but yeah, so sleepiness, right? Isn't that important? We have scriptural examples of this. Can you remember a time when there was somebody very important in the Bible, and he wanted some people to stay awake with him and watch through a very difficult night, and they just kept falling asleep? Can you remember an occasion where that happened? Yeah, the Lord in the garden the night that he was betrayed. They kept falling asleep. So yeah, sleep. And then what's the next thing? What's the other he contrasts this with? In verse 7. Yeah, getting drunk, getting intoxicated. So it's not that we're just making up a connection here between biblical sobriety. Look, it's common sense that you can't be right-minded spiritually if you're not even right-minded for the world. That's common sense. But more than common sense, it's directly stated here. It is a direct contrast to the idea of biblical sobriety to get intoxicated. And so Paul leaves no doubt about it in our minds in 1 Thessalonians. Let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 3. We're going to jump into the qualification of elders. A bishop must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, and sober-minded. So let me ask you something. If there was a man in the congregation who always had his speech slurred and acted erratically and was clearly on substances, and he said, "Hey, I want to be one of the elders," among other things, what would your first thought be? Could he possibly meet the qualification of being sober-minded? No. No, because is this term sober? Is the idea that an elder needs to be a bishop, a shepherd, that he needs to be sober-minded? Is that merely that he doesn't use drugs? No, it's higher than that, isn't it? He is the one who's going to watch for our souls. He's the one who's going to guide us. He's the one who's going to shepherd us, his fellow elders. He needs to be at a high level of sobriety, the biblical concept of being sober-minded. Yes, sir. Yeah, and that's a true statement. And when you think about intoxication, uh, one of the problems of intoxication is where my attention goes when I'm intoxicated. Uh, when I'm intoxicated, uh, typically there can be obviously different types of intoxication, and I'm no expert on the different types of intoxication, but I do know that there are reasons why you can't operate heavy machinery on intoxicating things, and that's because your attention is not where it needs to be. That means I know I get medicine sometimes that say, do not operate heavy machinery. And I always think about, I don't know, in my mind, I always think about those giant cranes, when they say that. And I'm sure they just mean like your car and stuff, but I always think about those giant like earth movers or something. And if you're intoxicated and you got one of those giant cranes or an earth mover, just think of the damage you could do, and knock a building down, kill a person. You can do the same thing with your car, right? You can crash into a building, crash into another car. You can kill somebody. But this, yeah, please. Yeah, that's where I was headed with that analogy. So you think about how the crane, you could kill somebody. Why would you kill somebody? Because your mind is not focused where it needs to be. Your mind maybe is on something you think is funny because you're intoxicated, or you get distracted over here because you're intoxicated, and then what happens? You don't see the person that's over here or the car that's driving over here, and you crash into it. You cause an accident and you kill that person. The word here for the elders, specifically the sobriety here, is to be circumspect. To be circumspect, which to be circumspect simply means that an elder's mind should be developed to a point that he can see all sides of things. He doesn't need to be, he can't have tunnel vision, he can't be distracted. He's supposed to be able to look around and say, here are the potential outcomes of these different decisions that I might make, and choose the correct one, to be circumspect, to see all around every different angle. Is an intoxicated person, in the sense of like literally physically intoxicated, is that known to be someone is that who you want to trust to be circumspect? No, it's not just that you haven't raised yourself to that level, you're not even capable of it when you are intoxicated. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, sober and alert would be appropriate for that concept of circumspection. Um, you're not circumspect if there's not an alert level to your sobriety. In other words, it does carry with it that idea. You're looking around and making sure that what you're doing, if you're doing is an elder, and look, those of us who maybe aren't as mature, but those of you who are more mature, but some of us who are younger, and even younger than me, we have a good idea and a good work we want to do, and we charge forward in it full-fledged, right? And we don't think about the fact that when I push forward in this work full-fledged, that I might be hurting something over here. Someone who's older, whether they're an elder by position or just an older brother and older sister who has more life experience, is the one who would say, hey, hold up a minute. by pushing here, you're messing this up. You need to do this a different way. And we need elders to do that. But we also just in general need older brothers and sisters to remind us of that. Again, if that brother or sister is drugs, they're not going to be useful to me in that situation, right? To be able to point that out to me. In fact, they're going to be the ones who violate that concept as well. So yeah, that's a good point. Regarding that repeat of this, we have a repeat of this in Titus 1:8. You can put that with your 1 Timothy 3:2. That's again talking about those qualifications of the elders, and that the elder needs to be sober-minded. And it's the same word there. No, I'm sorry, it's not the same word there. This goes back to the previous word we used before: safe in mind, self-controlled. It's interesting here that Strong's definition of this word, sophron, and the way that it's used in this passage is safe in mind, self-controlled. Is the use of a mind-altering substance synonymous with being self-controlled? No, obviously not. Obviously not. And so this concept of being self-controlled, again, would be automatically violated here. Could you violate that without using substances? Of course. But the use of these substances would automatically violate that. I want to point out something about that. That, again, just in secular culture, we understand this. The idea that elders need to be circumspect and the idea that they need to be self-controlled to lead the church. Do we have anything like that in our country with our president? What happens when the president is going to go in for a medical procedure and they're going to put him on drugs or put him under anesthesia? What happens? Vice president takes over until that procedure is completely done with. Why? I mean, even if the president is not put to sleep, if they put him on a mind-altering substance, then the vice president's going to take over. Why? You can't have a man on a mind-altering or a woman on the mind-altering substance making decisions about the future of our nation or about how to react to a certain threat to our nation. You can't have somebody on that mind-altering substance making those decisions or sitting in that seat. And so if we can get that in the secular sense on a national level, certainly we can grasp that on the level of the church. If we're having an elders meeting and one of the elders is on heavy meds because of an operation, he's probably going to sit that one out, right? He's not going to be making decisions for the congregation while he's on those heavy meds. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Yeah, don't be making, it's not a day to make decisions. Let's look at Titus. We're still in Titus. Let's look at Titus 2:1-2. Titus 2:1-2. But as for you, speak of things which are proper for sound doctrine, that the older men be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, in love, in patience. I want you to think about this for a moment. The reason we bring this back, we're going through the sober passages, but each one, I think, carries another thought for us in this principle. And Titus 2:1-2 really does. Because once you think about what he says here, he's describing how older brothers in the church ought to be. And this doesn't let me off the hook if I'm younger. Because if I'm a younger brother in the church, and he's going to go on to talk about the ladies as well, but he's talking here about the brothers. If I'm a younger brother in the church, what should I be doing? If he's saying this is how an older brother should be, if I'm a younger brother, what should I be doing? All right. Yes, sir. And if if he gives a picture of how an older brother should be, what God's idea of an older brother is, what his ideal for an older brother is, what should I, if I'm a young man, be doing? Following that example. I should be striving to become that. So we can say this is written to and written for older brothers, but that doesn't let me off the hook if I'm young. I don't get to say, well, what the world says, which is, well, I'm young, so I'll sow my wild oats, or I'm young, so I get to have. No, the idea here is that even if I'm young, this is my goal. This is where I'm headed. This is who I should be. This is who I want to be. I should be living my life day to day to grow into these things, right? Glenn Colley wrote a really good book called Headed to the Office. And the book is, each chapter is a different qualification for elders. And the argument of the book is that young men, he wrote it for teenage boys, young men ought to take the qualifications for elders and they ought to make it a part of their daily life to be growing in those areas. Because if that's God's idea of the men that he wants to lead the congregation, then in particular, the spiritual concepts of an elder, that young men ought to be growing in those areas. They ought to be growing toward that. So we look here and we says, the older men be sober. But here's what I want us to really take away from this passage. Look at the words that follow sober and ask yourself this question. Obviously, these, again, have a higher meaning than just not being intoxicated. But as the use of drugs, being intoxicated, does it match up with the words that follow this? Listen, reverent. Does the concept of being intoxicated lend itself to the idea of reverence toward God, or putting yourself, in other words, as an intoxicated person in a good position to show reverence toward God? No. Temperate. Now, come on. What is the classic movie television show concept of someone getting intoxicated? Is they get in a fight, right? They get into arguments, get into fights. And is temperance, is self-control, is that a concept of being intoxicated? Or is that something that is really even very likely intoxicated? No, doesn't lend itself toward that. Sound in faith. Now, I'm not going to say you never get someone who's intoxicated to be interested in matters of faith. I remember one time when I was in college, I was still learning the gospel, and I passed by, and these guys were like, "Where are you headed?" And I said, I would walk to the church building. The church building wasn't far from my apartment. I said, "I'm going to this church building to hang out with some friends." And the guy started asking me all these Bible questions. And I started answering his Bible questions, and I was like, he's intoxicated. I don't know why I'm having this discussion with him. And of course, the next day I went by to check in with those guys, and they wanted nothing to do with the conversation about the gospel. They were just being foolish because they were intoxicated. Does intoxication with a drug bring about the idea of being sound in faith? No, you wouldn't even have a Bible study with somebody if they were on drugs, would you? Somebody come up and said, "I'm on drugs right now and I want to study the Bible." What would you say? Come back, yeah, sober up and let's talk. How about I take you down to the center down here for drug abuse, and we get you checked in, and we get you off the drugs, and we'll have a study. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yes. Leviticus 10:10. Okay, just so you can catch up where we are, Brother Edwin is saying that we need to remember that we are a royal priesthood. If you're a Christian, you're a royal priest. You're a priest in God's kingdom. And so that we need to, as we're looking at these concepts, we need to keep that in mind. And then he's going to Leviticus 10:10. Yeah. No, that's a great thought. Romans 10:10, where God has given his commandment to Aaron. You know, the priesthood is going to come from Aaron. Aaron, it's the Aaronic priesthood. And he says to him, don't drink wine or intoxicating substance, you nor your sons. Why his sons? Because his sons are the next priests. And on down through that, his family are the priests. And he says, don't do it. And the reasoning was so you can distinguish between what is holy and unholy, what is clean and unclean. Now, you translate that over to the fact that we today are royal priesthood. Christians are. We are priests. He told them not to do that in the tabernacle, right? And you can think of that about that as well with Nadab and Abihu. There's contemplation that the reason they took the strange fire might have been they weren't in their right mind for one reason or another. But the bottom line is this. We know for a fact Aaron was told not to take it when he goes in the tabernacle. Now, they had a physical tabernacle, right? They could be in the tabernacle or out of the tabernacle. What's the tabernacle today? What does Paul say to the Corinthians is the tabernacle today? What is the temple today? The church is. He said, you individually are lively stones that build up the temple of God. We are the temple all the time. So that principle, tying it in together with the New Testament concept of who we are as Christians, is an excellent point. And I thank you for bringing that up. And we'll touch on that again when we handle alcohol and the use of alcohol in the church. Just to finish this out, our time is up. In Titus 2:2, he says, in love, that's agape love. Is it love if I check out on my family and friends because I get intoxicated to either to have fun or to handle my problems in an unsafe way or in a way that's not appropriate? No, it's not. And then finally, patience. Is the use of intoxicating substances typically the concept of patience? No, it is not. What are we drawing from this? We're drawing from this that there's more scriptures than this. What we're drawing from this is the recreational use of drugs is absolutely sinful. It cannot be in the life of a Christian because it violates many principles and some of the highest principles of Christianity. And so if I've got a problem with the recreational use of drugs, I need to open up to somebody about that. I need to talk to somebody about that. And I need to get the help that I need to get off of those drugs, whatever that substance might be. All right. Thank you for your time this morning. Hey, Bart, would you put that back on top of there? Now you know the secret hiding place. Well, it is kind of, it's a weird place for a marker to be, that's for sure. Yeah. I'll use, no, I don't need that.